Welcome back, guys. I'm Emily.
I'm Greg.
And today we are going to be discussing the short story from our Short Story Month compilations from Adventures in Time and Space. And of course, there are many other places you could find these short stories. But today we're going to be discussing The Blue Giraffe by L. Sprague de Camp.
Mm-hmm.
I thought this story was really fun. But go ahead and give us a little synopsis of de Camp if you get any info.
Okay. Well, like most of these authors we are reading, he sold his first story in, I think it was 1937 or 38.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time this was published in 1939, he hadn't published a whole lot yet.
Mm-hmm.
He was still pretty new to science fiction. And de Camp is less hard science fiction, a little more fantasy than other writers of that era. He wrote a lot of stories for Unknown Worlds, which was a companion magazine to Astounding, which focused on fantasy and horror.
Very nice.
And he often collaborated with another science fiction author named Fletcher Pratt.
Okay.
They wrote a whole series called The Complete, it was assembled together into what was called the Complete Enchanter, about a wizard. And they also, was he with Pratt for The Hand of Z and Queen of Zamba, and there's two other books that make up a whole series that's kind of a mixture of science fiction and fantasy. It's this world where they have technology, but they have magic, and it's all kind of mixed together.
That's kind of fun.
And
I like
that
those
was
kind of stories.
very famous in the 1950s.
Very nice.
And so de Camp was one of the major writers, again, during the golden age of science fiction through the 1940s, starting in 1939 and running through into the 1950s. People probably know him better today as the one who he kind of rewrote all the Conan stories.
Mm-hmm.
Him and Lynn Carter got together and they took Robert E. Howard stories and they wrote a lot of other stories to fill it. And a lot of people don't like it because it's not Robert E. Howard's original stuff. But what they did is they filled in a lot of the story that Howard never wrote because he didn't live long. He committed suicide in his 30s.
Yeah, I remember my husband telling me that background story.
Yeah.
He's kind of on a Conan the Barbarian kick right now.
And another thing de Camp is famous for is the very first book. I forget the title of it, but I used to have this book. It's the very first book about the craft of writing science fiction.
Oh.
He was one of the first
a professor
people
of sorts.
Well, yeah. And he wrote this book to help people to learn how to write science fiction at a time when nobody else had written anything like that. Now there's a book by Stephen King, and you got Sanderson on doing video.
The master classes
video
now.
Series. Yeah, everybody and his brother is doing their book or videos on how to write science fiction and fantasy. De Camp was the first one to do that sort of thing.
The Genesis. The first.
So that's kind of the foundation of what we're talking about here.
Yes.
And he published The Blue Giraffe. Again, it's one of his very first stories. It was published in 1939 in, I believe that one was in Astounding. And it's a little different for Astounding, but it does kind of fit.
I love the way it begins. So picture it. Little boy's at a table crying, and Dad goes, "What's the matter, son?" "Dad, am I adopted?" Yes, you are. Let me tell you why. That's essentially how the story starts. So he goes into this thing he used to work for, basically, he was like a soldier for the Queen of England or whatever, and he had been written, their association had been written multiple times that there was basically a preservation in Africa that was having some unusual happenings. And he had been written the head of the reservation has been kind of like, or preservatory, whatever they're calling it. The safari area.
They call it a park in this story,
yeah,
but I don't think it's quite what we are used to.
It's a safari park, essentially.
Yeah.
He has been kind of like vaguely telling people that something weird's going on here, and nobody believes him. So it's been like years now, and they finally send this guy down there, and he's like, all right, whatever. I'm going to go check it out. And he goes and sees the guy in Africa, and he's like, what seems to be the trouble that you're having? He's like, I have a blue giraffe. He's like, what? He's like, yeah, I've got a blue giraffe. I also have a 2-headed rhino and a green elephant with red spots. And he's like, oh, that's unusual. So he kind of goes around and he shows them these animals. He's like, what the heck? So they're kind of safaring to see if they can get, he can see some more of the weird, unusual animals that are around. And one night, their fire's running low. They hear wild animals kind of surrounding them and stuff. And the game master, whatever he is, chief of preservation there, whatever. Yeah. Park ranger, essentially. Yeah. Overglorified park ranger. Kind of goes and says, I'm going to go get more firewood. It's about a mile and a half away, though, so just kind of sit tight. So while the guy's sitting tight, he hears screaming of a woman, and he's, like, freaked out. So he kind of runs with his gun in that direction and kind of injures his foot and whatever, and finds that there's, like, a woman stuck in this tree. It's really dark, so I can't really see very well. There's a woman stuck in this tree, and there seems to be some kind of wild bull thing. Wildebeest or whatever kind of surrounding the tree and is very agitated and stuff. So he scares off the beast, and she comes down, and he can't figure out how to get back to his camp. So he's asking her name, and they kind of have like a comedic banter where this woman is just not getting it at all, and he's just frustrated with her, and like the whole thing's this really interesting situational comedy. But her name translates to baboon woman. And so he's like, that's weird. So as like the sun's coming up and they're traveling towards her village, because she's like, we can get your foot looked at and, get you taken care of and stuff. As the sun comes up, he realizes, oh my gosh, this woman is a baboon woman. Like, she's a talking baboon, essentially. Humanoid for the most part, except baboon face. So he gets to their camp and finds out from her father, who's the leader of the camp, that there had been a scientist and his, like, minion, I guess. So basically the Igor to his Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Who kind of were in the woods, and he was like the first, and he doesn't exactly remember like being born or anything, but he recognizes that he was the first of his kind of the baboon people, and kind of gives him this interesting history of this machine that's out in the woods that nobody goes close to, because if you go close to it, weird things happen to animals. So so the main character recognizes, oh, there must be some kind of radiation or something coming from this that's mutating these animals or making these offspring of these animals look weird. So he's sitting there contemplating that in the hut, and the baboon woman comes in, and she's like, well, we're gonna get married. And he's like, what? And she's like, yep, my father set on it. You'll probably die if you try to run. So he's like sitting there panicking in this thing, like, I don't know how to get out of this. Yeah, I just saved her life, but I don't want to marry a baboon-faced woman, like trying not to make it like about her being ugly, but it was about her being ugly. And then while he's laying there trying to figure out how to get out of this, her lover breaks into the hut and says, I have to kill you. And he's like, you don't have to kill me. I don't want her. And he's like, I'm offended that you don't want her. She's beautiful. And then he's like, listen, nobody has to die. Let's just figure out if I could go and like shut off this machine and get the heck out of here and find the park ranger again. I can get out of your life and no one has to challenge you for your lover at all. And he's like, oh, okay. So he like helps him escape and stuff like that. But so he goes, he finds the machine and has to turn it off and things. And, it's a very exciting ending. But basically this whole story was, I don't mind spoiling this one because it's really funny, because the whole story is basically like, and that's why I adopted you, because I was within range of the machine, and if I had offspring, they'd be freaks. And so like that was the whole story that he told this kid. What's interesting is it's so far-fetched, it's hard to believe that that is actually a real story. So you wonder, is he really telling the truth to his adopted son about his why he's been adopted? Or is it just to make his son feel better? And his son is like 12 years old, so he's still in that good age where there's still plausible deniability. And, he might still believe in Santa. You don't know for sure. But this was a really great comedy story. I don't mind spoiling it for you. I definitely think you should read it, because the conversational banter and situational humor in it is far better than I described it. It's really great. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, this is another good example where it's a short story. What is it, like 20 pages?
Yeah, like 20 some odd pages.
It's
Maybe
a short
less.
story written in the 1940s, the golden age of science fiction. So it's classic. It's 80 years old.
Mm-hmm.
1939. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's more than 80 years old already. And you have a lot of humor. You have some great characterization. You have a great story. And it's thoroughly enjoyable, and it's short, and you don't need it to be any longer. It's a perfect short story.
The world building is fantastic in it.
Mhm.
The characterization is fantastic.
There's a lot of imagination.
Yes.
This is proof positive that classic science fiction has it all if you look to the right sources.
Absolutely. And this is a good balance of adventure and comedy.
Mm-hmm.
This is not one of those ones where you feel like it's too much on the comedy or it's too much on like they're walking through the jungle. It gives you such interesting details because as they're walking, they're also encountering more of these genetically altered creatures, and you're kind of getting this really great sense of like, why has no one come down here?
Yeah.
But one of the things too that they talk about in here that I forgot to mention in the story is that the reason that the park ranger wants this to be figured out is because the animals that are mutated and look weird have a very short lifespan. And eventually he's afraid that he's going to run out of animals and not have a preserve anymore.
Yeah.
And he wants to preserve these animals and make sure that they have healthy offspring and help populate these areas and stuff like that. And in this day and age, we would feel the same way. Like the elephants, dang, man, the elephants are dying off. Let them have healthy babies. But
and you do have to remember that this is 1939. We had all of the 1950s where people seriously believed that atomic experiments would create all kinds of giant creatures and
that radiation would do
ants
weird
out of
stuff.
Control and people that
giant
grow
bugs.
really big and know, so the things that are happening in this story, I'm sure DeCamp knew that he was telling a tall tale, but people bought it back then.
Yeah, they definitely did. And I think it's kind of always been a thing where people have been concerned about what radiation and radio waves will do to offspring and human bodies and things like that. And yes, it's been connected with cancer, but we haven't found any other really strange things since other than abnormal cells that could become cancers.
You can have
get it from the sun.
Some odd births where they'll have a third, an animal have
second
a
head and second
fifth leg or
consciousness
something, and but not the kind of mutations that are talked about in science fiction.
And I think too, like,
and they don't live.
Yeah, usually they don't. But yeah, I think what's interesting is that I love the quirkiness. I think the quirkiness of the radioactivity was supposed to make it more satirical of how people were afraid of radiation. And yes, radiation can be dangerous, but treated well and properly, it really is not that big a deal.
It's like everything. In moderation, we can use it to do good things.
Exactly. And like the sun has radiation. It produces most of the life on our planet. We can't just write off all radiation as bad.
Yeah, you actually get vitamins from sunlight. So
yeah. So it's one of those things too that I think, though it is obviously satirical, I can see people being concerned because the satire is taken so seriously and at such face value. Even the witty like banter between people is so intelligent. How can you not find it believable? So it does lean heavily on some plausible deniability in this story for both the reader and the characters in it. But it's treated really well. I liked it a lot. It was pretty fun adventure story. And the animals in it were just so interesting.
Yeah, like the crocodile.
The crocodile that's basically a horse. But it still like goes like this.
He's riding the crocodile, and of course that's very painful.
Yeah. I mean, his pants were worn through by the end of riding the crocodile. It was pretty intense. I'm not a huge fan of crocodiles and alligators, so that part I was like, oh yeah, you couldn't pay me enough to get on that. That's a huge
or what was the one with two heads it
was a rhino.
He
called it Tweedle.
Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
Tweedledee and Tweedledum because they had two different consciousnesses.
The rhino charges them, and he did something to cause the rhino to start going in a circle.
Yeah, what he did was Tweedledee is very aggressive and Tweedledum is very scared and skittish. So basically what he does is Tweedledee has the left side and Tweedledum has the right side. So he scared Tweedledum so that Tweedledum would try to run away while Tweedledee would try to run and charge them. So they ended up going in a circle.
That was
it's
hilarious.
Really funny. I liked that a lot. And I just love the interaction between the main character and the baboon woman.
Mm-hmm.
There's just so much cultural miscommunication and just like their logic is so like they're so parallel. They're just missing each other. They're this close to getting it, but this close to communicating it. A lot of great situational humor. This is some pretty solid comedy. Again, this kind of had like Men in Black Safari vibes. So if you like Men in Black, you'd probably enjoy a story like this. Or like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It has that kind of witty banter where you're just kind of like having these absurd conversations.
I feel the only thing comparable today, but it's very different, is like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or the Discworld novels.
Yes, where you're having like these
very humorous, but they're very different from the kind of stories that were written in the 40s, the humorous science fiction back then.
Yeah, and I really like it because like this is the kind of story I would have really appreciated to bring into a cultural communications class, multicultural communications class, or like intercultural communications class. Because this is a prime example of how two cultures can just be so close but so far from communicating correctly. Yeah. Like they're just on the cusp of getting there, but they're just missing each other. I thought that was really great. It's like watching an episode of Gilmore Girls, but it's science fiction. It's just really fast-paced, witty, funny banter.
Yeah, so that's 3 out of the 4 authors we've talked about in this series are people that are not very well remembered anymore. Yeah. And it's, I of course know them because I'm old, but it's been blowing my mind why people aren't discovering this stuff.
Absolutely.
They're great authors with a lot of fun stories.
And as a young person, I like a variety. Even within a genre, I don't want to keep reading the same thing over and over. And this just proves to me, like through this whole series of going through these short stories in a specifically science fiction compilation, really shows me the diversity of how people can take an idea and run with it, but still have it be within the same genre. I don't think we touched on anything that was similar to the next. And I have yet to read a bad story in Adventures in Time and Space. So,
it's that's why it's such a well-known anthology. But pulling from the astounding of the 40s, like I say, you'd have whole issues where everything in it was just mind-blowing. You'll never see that again, and it's just so easy to compile an anthology from that time period of really good fiction.
So we can't recommend this kind of stuff enough. People who don't enjoy short stories, we feel they're just missing out, for one, and probably not finding what they're really looking for in a story, for two. Unless they're looking for something longer because they just appreciate longer literature, which is fine. Yeah. But you're really missing out on some really great literature for busy lifestyles if you kind of skip over the short story stuff. Yeah,
sometimes the long stuff is great, but sometimes, like when I finished Wuthering Heights, I needed something light and short.
Yeah. That's some heavy stuff. Or like if you just spent all of October reading Stephen King and you're just like, this was great. I am depressed. Need something lighter. The Blue Giraffe is great for that. So definitely there's a lot of great stuff, I think. And this month reading short stories has been really fun for me. It definitely was the recovery.
Tip of the iceberg.
I know.
What we can pull from that time period.
We have so many great things coming down the line too. We will never stop talking to you guys about short stories because we want those of you who don't like short stories to get on the bandwagon. Because you're really missing out on some really great pieces of literature. And some of these were the very first works ever of some of these authors. They didn't start with a book. They started with this. And poetry.
And you have so many short stories in the 1940s because publishers weren't publishing science fiction novels or fantasy or horror. And it was only the pulp magazines that were publishing it. And of course, you made more money publishing a whole bunch of short stories than you did trying to sell a novel, which would have to be split up and serialized over a number of issues.
And plus, magazines were just cheaper for people to get a hold of back in the day.
Yeah.
It was far less
expensive.
Look
at the covers, 5 and 10 cents for these things.
Yeah, absolutely. It was just much easier to get your hands on good pieces of literature for less expensive than trying to buy entire libraries of hardback books, because paperbacks really weren't a super big thing either. They were becoming by that point, but not really.
You didn't see paperbacks till the mid-40s.
Mm-hmm. So it was just on the earliest part of getting paperback books out there, which was, again, another much more accessible thing for the common reader. But magazines are really where it started, and especially for science fiction. Yeah,
you didn't see books or paperbacks until like the 1950-51. Especially Ace Books came out with their whole line of doubles. That's where Philip K. Dick got his start as a novelist in the Ace doubles in the 1950s.
Very nice.
And but in the 1940s, which was what this was drawing upon, it was mostly shorter works.
So yeah, we've gone through this month and really found some great stories. So we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope we get you reading short stories. And please let us know if you have any compilations or short stories that you really enjoy. If you want us to check them out, we're more than happy to do that. So yeah, hit us up. We like to read. Tell us what you want us to talk about. That's all I have for this one.
Okay, that's all I got.
Yeah. So this was a good one. Nice fun reads. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.